Long before the Three Kingdoms period, the Korean Peninsula was home to complex societies whose political organization laid the foundations for the first Korean states. The peninsula, stretching roughly 1,000 kilometers from the Amnok River in the north to the Korea Strait in the south, is a geographically diverse landscape of river valleys, coastal plains, and mountainous interiors. This environment shaped the nature and pace of human settlement for tens of thousands of years. Archaeological evidence indicates that anatomically modern humans inhabited the Korean Peninsula by at least 40,000 BCE, with Paleolithic sites discovered across both the northern and southern regions. By the Neolithic period, broadly dated between 8,000 and 1,500 BCE in the Korean context, populations were producing distinctive comb-patterned pottery, known in Korean archaeology as jeolmunware, associated with semi-sedentary communities engaged in fishing, foraging, and early cultivation along river systems and coastal areas. Scholars such as Sarah M. Nelson, in her foundational work The Archaeology of Korea, 1993, Cambridge University Press, have documented how these Neolithic communities were not isolated. Exchange networks and material culture indicate connections across the Yellow Sea and the broader Northeast Asian region. The transition to the Bronze Age on the peninsula, roughly 1500 to 300 BCE, brought significant social change. The appearance of mumun pottery, large-scale agricultural settlements, and megalithic tombs called dolmens reflects increasing social complexity. Korea is home to one of the largest concentrations of dolmens in the world, with over 30,000 recorded examples recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These monuments are widely interpreted by archaeologists as markers of social hierarchy and ancestral authority, suggesting the emergence of ranked societies predating any recognizable state. It is important to note what the evidence allows us to say and what it does not. The peninsula in this period cannot yet be described as politically unified, nor do the available materials support identifying distinct ethnic or proto-national groups in the modern sense. Archaeologists caution against reading later historical or nationalist narratives backward into prehistoric data. What is clear is this: by the time the first textual references to organized polities on the peninsula appear, largely in Chinese chronicles from the first millennium BCE onward, the societies producing those references had already been shaped by millennia of accumulated cultural, agricultural, and social development. This is where the story of the Korean kingdoms begins, not with a single founder or a single moment, but with a long and complex foundation built across centuries. If you find the deep history of East Asia as fascinating as we do, please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who loves history. It genuinely helps us keep making content like this. The Bronze Age on the Korean Peninsula, roughly 1500 to 300 BCE, represents one of the most significant turning points in the region's prehistory. It was during this period that the material foundations for social stratification, territorial organization, and eventually state formation began to take shape. The dominant archaeological culture of this era is associated with mumun pottery, plain, undecorated ceramics whose distribution across the peninsula marks a broad cultural horizon. This pottery appears alongside a shift toward intensive rice and millet cultivation in settled agricultural villages. Sites such as the Goguryeo cultural complex in South Chungcheong province have been extensively excavated and studied, revealing large villages with clearly differentiated architectural features suggesting social distinction between households. Bronze artifacts, including finely crafted daggers with distinctive slender blades called Korean-type bronze daggers or lute-shaped bronze daggers, appear in the archaeological record from roughly the 10th century BCE onward. These objects, found predominantly in burial contexts rather than as utilitarian tools, strongly suggest their role as prestige items marking elite status. Scholars including Gina Lee Barnes, State Formation in Korea, 2001, Curzon Press, have argued that the differential distribution of bronze prestige goods is consistent with the emergence of ranked chiefly societies rather than egalitarian communities. The dolmen phenomenon deserves particular attention. These megalithic structures, large capstone slabs supported by upright stones covering burial chambers, appear across the peninsula in enormous numbers. Research by Korean archaeologists, particularly from institutions such as Seoul National University and the National Museum of Korea, has established that dolmen construction required significant communal labor mobilization, implying social authority capable of organizing such efforts. However, scholars debate whether dolmen builders should be characterized as chiefs, clan leaders, or some other form of ranked authority. The evidence supports hierarchy. It does not yet clearly indicate the kind of centralized political authority associated with a state. The introduction of iron technology to the peninsula, broadly dated to around 400 to 300 BCE, accelerated these trends dramatically. Iron tools made agricultural intensification more efficient, while iron weapons shifted the balance of conflict and defense. The transition from bronze to iron is not a sharp break, but an overlap, with both materials present simultaneously for several centuries. Taken together, the Bronze and Early Iron Age record presents us with a peninsula populated by competing, ranked agricultural societies, complex enough to organize labor, produce prestige goods, and bury their elite members with considerable ceremony, but not yet organizing themselves into the kind of geographically extensive, administratively structured polities that historians typically call states. No discussion of Korean state origins can proceed without addressing Gojoseon, the polity described in both Korean and Chinese textual sources as the earliest Korean political entity. Gojoseon occupies an unusual and sometimes contentious position in both scholarship and national memory, and understanding it requires carefully separating the layers of evidence, legend, and later interpretation. The earliest Korean historical text to describe Gojoseon in detail is the Samguk Yusa, Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, compiled by the Buddhist monk Iryeon in the late 13th century CE. This text records the founding myth of Gojoseon, that the god Hwanung descended to earth and that his son Dangun Wangum founded a state on the peninsula in 2333 BCE. This mythological founding narrative has carried enormous cultural significance in Korean historical consciousness, but it is important to be clear, no archaeological or contemporaneous written evidence supports a unified, centrally administered Korean state in the 3rd millennium BCE. Most historians treat the Dangun narrative as a foundation myth with potential symbolic or cultural memory dimensions rather than a literal historical account. Chinese textual sources provide the earliest contemporaneous written references to polities on or near the Korean peninsula. The Shanhai Jing, Classic of Mountains and Seas, and the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, compiled by Sima Chen in the late 2nd century BCE, refer to a polity called Joseon in the context of northeastern territories beyond the Yan state's frontier. These references describe a political entity capable of military resistance and diplomatic interaction with Chinese states, indicators of meaningful political organization, but the geographic boundaries, internal structure, and ethnic composition of this Joseon remain subjects of scholarly debate. The historical record becomes clearer, though still contested, in the 2nd century BCE. Chinese sources record that following the collapse of the Yan state, a man named Weiman in Chinese, migrated from the former Yan territory, eventually seized control of Joseon around 194 BCE and established what historians often call Weiman Joseon. This state maintained diplomatic relations with the Han dynasty before being conquered by Han military forces in 108 BCE, after which the Han established commanderies, administrative districts, in parts of the former Joseon territory. The location of Gojoseon's political center remains actively debated. Traditional Korean historiography and some North Korean scholarship have placed it in the vicinity of the Liaodong Peninsula or further west, while a majority of South Korean and international scholars associate the later phases of Gojoseon with the Daedong River basin near modern Pyongyang. Neither position should be treated as definitively resolved.
What Gojoseon represents, at minimum, is evidence that by the 2nd century BCE, at the latest, politically organized polities capable of statecraft, diplomacy, and military organization existed on or adjacent to the Korean Peninsula. Whether these polities constitute fully formed states in a theoretical sense remains a genuine scholarly question.
One of the central methodological challenges in studying early Korean history is the relationship between written records and archaeological evidence. In many cases, these two categories of evidence do not align neatly, and scholars must navigate the gaps carefully. The primary written sources for the early Korean peninsula come almost exclusively from Chinese dynastic histories: the Shiji, the Hanshu, the Book of Han, the Hao Hanshu, the Book of the Later Han, and the Songguoji, records of the Three Kingdoms, all contain passages describing the peoples and polities of the peninsula and surrounding regions. These texts were compiled by Chinese officials and historians writing from a Chinese administrative and cultural perspective. As a result, they tend to emphasize interactions with Chinese states, tribute missions, military conflicts, diplomatic relations, and they reflect Chinese geographic and cultural assumptions about the peoples beyond their frontiers. Scholars, including Mark Byington, editor of The Hand Commanderies in Early Korean History, 2013, Korea Institute, Harvard University, have cautioned that Chinese sources must be read critically and contextually. The accounts describe a mosaic of named groups on the peninsula, including the Ye, the Mayak, the Samhan confederacies of the south, and others, but the relationship between these named groups and the archaeological cultures visible in the material record is not always clear. Archaeological research on the Korean Peninsula has expanded dramatically since the mid-20th century, particularly through large-scale excavations by South Korean institutions such as the National Museum of Korea, Ewha Women's University, and the Archaeological Institute of Korea. This work has substantially refined our understanding of settlement patterns, artifact distributions, and cultural change across the peninsula. However, archaeology and text often illuminate different things. Archaeological evidence is excellent for documenting material culture, subsistence strategies, and broad social patterns, but it rarely allows us to attach the specific political names or ethnic labels found in Chinese texts to specific archaeological assemblages. Conversely, Chinese texts provide named actors and political events, but rarely with sufficient geographic or chronological precision to map directly onto the archaeological record. A concrete example of this tension involves the Leilong Commandery, a Han Chinese administrative district established in 108 BCE in the former Weimon Joseon territory, identified with excavated sites near modern Pyongyang. The material culture of Leilong period sites shows clear Chinese administrative influence alongside local Korean material traditions. Scholars debate the degree to which Leilong represented cultural assimilation, a colonial imposition, or a hybrid frontier society, and this debate has direct implications for how we understand the cultural and political identity of the Korean societies that emerged after Leilong's eventual decline in the 4th century CE. The lesson is methodological. Reconstructing early Korean political history requires integrating multiple categories of evidence, textual, archaeological, and comparative, while being honest about the limitations of each. The emergence of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, the three polities that historians call the Three Kingdoms of Korea, represents the culmination of centuries of social and political development on the peninsula. Their formation was not sudden or simultaneous, and the traditional founding dates recorded in Korean historical sources should be understood as politically constructed narratives rather than precise historical facts. Goguryeo is the earliest to appear in contemporaneous written records. Chinese sources describe it as a significant political and military force in the region of the Middle and Upper Yalu River by at least the 1st century BCE and possibly earlier. The Songguoji
compiled in the 3rd century CE, provides detailed ethnographic descriptions of Goguryeo society, noting its warrior culture, stratified social structure, and traditions of communal feasting and ceremony. Archaeological evidence from the Hando Mountain Fortress and Gungne Fortress sites, identified as early Goguryeo capitals, confirms substantial political organization by the early centuries of the Common Era. The Samguk Sagi, the 12th century Korean historical text compiled by Kim Bushik, records Goguryeo's founding as 37 BCE by a figure named Jumong, also known as Daomyeong-song. While the Jumong narrative contains clearly legendary elements, most scholars accept that it preserves a memory of Goguryeo's consolidation as a territorial state in the general time frame of the 1st century BCE to 1st century CE. Baekje is traditionally said to have been founded in 18 BCE in the Han River Basin, the area of modern Seoul, also by descendants of the Jumong lineage, according to later Korean texts. By the 4th century CE, it had become a substantial territorial state with sophisticated political institutions, extensive maritime trade networks connecting it to China and Japan, and a royal court capable of patronizing Buddhist art and architecture. The royal tombs of Baekje at Muryong, excavated in 1971 and preserved at the Gyeongju National Museum, provide remarkable direct evidence of elite material culture and royal identity. Silla, located in the southeastern part of the peninsula, in the Gyeongju Basin, developed somewhat later as a fully centralized state. Its traditional founding is recorded as 57 BCE, but archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Silla's consolidation as a true territorial kingdom occurred primarily in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. The extraordinary Silla royal tombs of Gyeongju, massive earthen burial mounds containing gold crowns, glass vessels, and elaborate horse gear, reflect a wealthy and hierarchically organized society, though the precise political institutions of early Silla remain subjects of ongoing research. It is important to acknowledge that the boundaries between these three polities and the smaller polities they absorbed, including the Gaia Confederacy of the Southern Peninsula, were fluid and contested throughout this period. The Three Kingdoms framework reflects later Korean historical retrospection and should not be taken to imply clearly delineated, mutually exclusive territorial states from the earliest periods of their existence.
Understanding how the early Korean kingdoms were actually organized, rather than simply when they emerged, requires looking beyond royal founding narratives to the internal structures of power that made these polities function. Early Korean kingdoms did not emerge as fully formed centralized monarchies. The available evidence suggests a more gradual transition from confederative or council-based forms of authority toward more centralized kingship. Chinese sources describing Goguryeo note the existence of powerful noble clans whose collective deliberations appear to have constrained royal authority, at least in the early centuries. This pattern of noble councils alongside royal leadership is also visible in Silla, where the Hwabaek Council of Aristocratic Leaders played a significant constitutional role in decision-making, including in the selection of rulers. The consolidation of royal authority in all three kingdoms appears associated with a series of related processes documented in both textual sources and the archaeological record. The adoption of Buddhism as a royal religion, providing ideological legitimation for centralized monarchy, the development of legal codes and administrative bureaucracy, the standardization of official ranks and court hierarchy, and the construction of monumental royal tombs and Buddhist temples as expressions of royal power. Goguryeo's adoption of Buddhism is traditionally dated to 372 CE, during the reign of King Soserim, when a monk from the former Qin state arrived at the Goguryeo court. Baekje adopted Buddhism shortly afterward, around 384 CE. In Silla, the process was more contested and is traditionally dated to 527 CE, associated with the martyrdom of the monk Ichidan, suggesting that Buddhist adoption in Silla faced significant opposition from established noble and shamanistic ritual interests before royal authority was sufficient to impose it. The development of written law codes is another indicator of state consolidation. While no complete early Korean law code survives, both Korean and Chinese sources reference legal reforms in all three kingdoms during the 3rd through 5th centuries CE, consistent with the general East Asian pattern of states adopting Chinese-influenced administrative frameworks to manage growing territorial and population complexity. It is also worth noting that the concept of kingship itself evolved significantly during this period. Early rulers of these polities may have functioned more as paramount chiefs or sacred ritual leaders than as administrative monarchs in the later Chinese-influenced sense. The transition toward a more clearly administrative kingship, with royal officials governing territories on the king's behalf rather than through clan-based networks, was a gradual process whose precise timeline varied by kingdom and region. This complexity is precisely what makes the early Korean kingdoms historically significant. They represent not a single moment of state creation, but a centuries-long process of political experimentation and institution building. We began this documentary with a straightforward observation. The Korean kingdoms did not appear suddenly. They were the product of millennia of accumulated social complexity, political experimentation, environmental adaptation, and cultural exchange. The archaeological record, from the comb-patterned pottery of the Neolithic, to the dolmens and bronze daggers of the Bronze Age, to the walled settlements of the Iron Age, documents a peninsula whose populations were developing increasingly sophisticated social hierarchies and political institutions long before the first written reference to any named Korean polity. The textual record, primarily preserved in Chinese dynastic histories and later Korean compilations such as the Samguk Sagi and Samguk Yusa, provides named actors, political events, and a rough chronological framework. But these texts must be read critically. They reflect the perspectives, agendas, and limitations of their authors, and they cannot be taken as straightforward historical reports. What emerges from integrating these categories of evidence is a picture of early Korean state formation as a regional process, embedded in a broader Northeast Asian context. The emergence of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla as territorial states was shaped not only by internal social dynamics, but also by competition and interaction with Chinese states, by migration and exchange across the Yellow Sea and the Yalu River Zone, and by the stimulus of the Han Chinese commanderies that operated on the peninsula for several centuries. Several important points of scholarly debate remain unresolved and deserve acknowledgement. The location and nature of Gojoseon, particularly its earliest phases, remains contested, as does the precise relationship between the archaeological cultures of the Bronze and Iron Ages and the named political groups appearing in textual sources. The degree to which Chinese cultural influence was adopted, adapted, or resisted by early Korean polities is an ongoing area of research, as is the question of how much internal diversity existed within each of the three kingdoms. For students and viewers who wish to explore these questions further, the scholarship of researchers including Gina Lee Barnes, Sarah Nelson, Mark Byington, and Korean scholars publishing through institutions such as the National Museum of Korea, Seoul National University, and the Academy of Korean Studies provides rigorous and accessible entry points. The history of the Korean kingdoms is not a simple story of linear national development stretching from mythological antiquity to historical reality. It is a more interesting story, one of diverse and inventive societies adapting, competing, and building political institutions in response to real environmental, social, and geopolitical pressures across several millennia. That complexity is not a weakness of the historical record. It is what makes this subject genuinely worthy of continued scholarly attention and continued curiosity.